Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Theology 621, Lecture 2b, where we're going to look at the synoptic problem. The synoptic problem is challenging and a little bit of a brain teaser, but I think if you approach it like a mystery to be unraveled, it can actually be a lot of fun. And in the end of the day, arriving at the right solution, if there is a solution, is not as important as understanding some of the basic facts so that we can better appreciate Matthew, Mark, and Luke in their relatedness. So I'm going to jump into things and start with some basic facts. Fact 1. The Gospel of Matthew has 600 of Mark's 661 verses. Verse is an anachronistic term because the ancient Bibles didn't have our verses, but this gives us a rough and ready idea of the percentage of content that Matthew preserves from Mark. That is, a tremendous amount of Mark reappears in Matthew. Luke has 300 of Mark's 661 verses. Luke has used less of Mark. Now, of course, I shouldn't say Luke has used less of Mark because that prejudices the question we're trying to get at, namely, what is their relationship? Fact number 3. Matthew and Luke share 240 verses not found in Mark. And this is mostly sayings and discourses as opposed to narrative material. Furthermore, and this gets particularly interesting and suggestive, the narrative sequence is similar between all three Gospels when all three have the same story. However, Matthew and Luke material, that is what they share that they do not share in common with Mark, is rarely in the same place. Now, I'll illustrate what that means and what that looks like, because this is probably the most important clue for solving the synoptic problem. Let's take a parallel set of passages. Let's look at some of this Luke and Matthew material. If we look at Luke 13 and Matthew 23, we can see two sayings that are almost verbatim identical. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often I've desired to gather your children together as a hen, and so on and so forth. We see only a couple words in this whole pericope that differ. Matthew has, your house is left desolate. Luke adds, until the time comes when. These are almost identical. And in fact, this even goes down to the spelling of the Greek word for Jerusalem. Jerusalem can be spelled in the Greek language in two different ways. Matthew has the word Jerusalem 12 times. In this saying is the only time he uses this particular spelling, and it's the same version of the same spelling you get in Luke. So they're not only verbatim, they're even spelled the same way, even where that diverges from Matthew's normal spelling. You get my point. Hold on to that fact. We'll come back to this saying. Let's take another saying where Matthew and Luke have common material. Luke 19, Matthew 21. He's approaching the Mount of Olives, and we get this saying, "Blessed is the King, or the one who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna in the highest, glory in the highest heaven," or Hosanna in the highest heaven. The parallel material is not as extensive, but we have something rather striking, which is, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." That's what the other saying talked about. Now, the reason this is important is because Matthew and Luke, although they have in this case two separate sayings almost identically, they position these sayings in different places. So Luke has Jerusalem, Jerusalem in Luke 13. Matthew has it in Matthew 23. The chapters aren't important, but the relative order is quite important. After all, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is predicting, "You won't see me until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" When is that fulfilled in the Gospel of Luke? When Jesus comes to Jerusalem in chapter 19, and the people say, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." In Luke, the meaning of Jesus' saying is fulfilled in the story. In Matthew, Jesus has already entered Jerusalem, which means if he says, while standing in Jerusalem, you won't see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, he's predicting a second coming, a heavenly coming. The same saying has tremendously different meaning depending on its context vis-a-vis his entry to Jerusalem. And where is the saying that they have in common placed? That's a saying they share with the Gospel of Mark, and all three Gospels place that saying in the same narrative context. It's when Jesus finally arrives in Jerusalem and the people hail him as king. So this is what we mean when we say that when Matthew, Mark, and Luke share material, they tend to place it in the same point in their stories. When only Matthew and Luke share a saying, they almost never put it in the same place. We will illustrate that with a further example, and then we'll think about its implication. So first, the further example. We have the Gospel of Matthew in the left-hand column now. The Gospel of Matthew 24, we have what's called the eschatological discourse, and Jesus is talking about signs of the end. He says, this generation will not pass away. What will it be like, Jesus? He said it'll be like the days of Noah. In other words, it's going to be real sudden. You're just going to be doing your thing, and then the rain start falling, just like that. And he says, you need to be like a watchful householder, because you don't know when the thief's coming. Luke has these same sayings. This generation will not pass away. It'll be like the days of Noah. You need to be like a watchful householder. But you can see I've put in red the verses in Luke, because Luke doesn't include the saying about Noah or the watchful householder in Luke's eschatological discourse. Luke's discourse occurs in chapter 21. Luke has scattered these sayings throughout his gospel. The one saying they do have in the same place in the eschatological discourse is a saying that they share with Mark 13, where Mark has an eschatological discourse. So, these are the basic data, and we could multiply examples, but they would basically confirm this picture. How do you explain it? Well, as you will know from having read your textbook, the dominant theory is what's called the two-source hypothesis. And that is that Mark and a sayings source called Q were available to Matthew and Luke. Matthew used Mark and Q, Luke used Mark and Q. Before we sort of say more and complicate the story, we just want to say why this diagram does a good job of explaining the basic facts. It does a good job because this diagram works well for the fact that Mark is what we might call the middle term, which is to say, Matthew and Luke agree with Mark and sometimes agree with each other and agree with Mark, but they don't usually agree with each other against Mark. Let's illustrate that. Mark as the middle term. Here's a story where I've color-coded some of the words. And what you'll see is that in some instances, Matthew and Mark agree, having passed on. Luke doesn't have that. Matthew has something that differs from both Mark and Luke. Mark and Luke just have he saw. Come to the third line. Both Mark and Luke say that the tax collector's name is Levi. Matthew doesn't. We come further down. Matthew names the tax collector Matthew. We come further down, and there's even little small similarities and differences. Matthew says to him, Mark, he says to him, present tense of the verb. Luke has an aorist tense of the verb, past tense, and he said to him. Luke adds an extra clause, having left everything. You get the point. What you find here is Matthew and Mark agreeing, Luke and Mark agreeing, but rarely Matthew and Luke agreeing against Mark. Mark seems to be the middle term. That makes sense if Matthew and Luke have used Mark. After all, Matthew's using Mark and he makes a little change here and there. Luke's using Mark and he makes a little change here and there. You'd expect Matthew and Luke to look like Mark, but not to look like each other. Second, this is to recapitulate what I already stated. Luke and Matthew diverge in this placement of the material they have in common. Q is by definition, I mean, we don't have Q, Q is hypothetical. Q is by definition the material common to Matthew and Luke. So to say that they diverge in their placement of Q is just to say things they have in common that they don't have from Mark, they diverge where in their stories they place it. I already showed you 2 examples of this. We could show more. No one can serve 2 masters. Almost identical in these sayings. Matthew puts it in his great Sermon on the Mount. Luke, who has a Sermon on the Plain, doesn't even put it in the Sermon on the Plain. Luke puts it in an entirely different context. There's lots of instances of this. This is compelling enough to suggest there must be something like a sayings source, and that the sayings source didn't have narrative connecting it, so that you might see the saying, and if you were writing your own biography of Jesus, you would think, that's a terrific saying. I wonder when he said that. Early in his ministry? Late in his ministry? With which other sayings? And you had to decide, and hence we see Matthew put the sayings in some places, and Luke put them in other places. So far, so good. This is a plausible hypothesis. I want to address here the possibility of the original language of this saying source. And it's not out of the question that the source originated in Aramaic. There are some instances where you get more or less parallel sayings with a strange deviation. And the deviation could be well accounted for if there were different understandings or misunderstandings of Aramaic. So here's an example. Matthew 23, Jesus says, first clean the inside of the cup so that the outside is clean. Luke 11, give alms for the inside so that everything is clean. That's weird. Those things sound really different and yet really similar. Well, if you imagine, Jesus is of course teaching primarily in Aramaic. What if you retrovert these Greek sayings into Aramaic? You realize that the word for cleanse is dakao, and the word for give alms is zakao, and the dalet, the D, and the zayin are very similarly shaped letters. If you tarry with hypotheses like this, you can even go further and you can say, aha, this is a sight error, not a sound error. In other words, this isn't something someone misheard, this is something somebody miscopied, which means Q would have at some point been Aramaic and written. It means it gives you a clue to when things were committed to writing. And that must have been early because, and again, I'm trying to keep the story relatively simple, although I illustrate this sort of case, Q at some point had to be Greek. There had to be a Greek saying source because so much of the sayings material is verbatim in Matthew and in Luke. And if Matthew and Luke were independently translating an Aramaic source into Greek, they wouldn't arrive at the same words again and again. So staying with the two-source hypothesis, a third point in favor of this basic diagram is that Luke and Matthew diverge from each other a lot when they don't have Mark or Q. In other words, if we come to the sayings material, the birth narratives, Matthew 1 and 2, Luke 1 and 2, there is no point in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke where they're more different. Where are Jesus' parents from? What's his relationship to John the Baptist? What year was he born? All these things are totally different, and the stories are just totally different. Luke doesn't have magi, Matthew doesn't have shepherds. They're totally different stories. Well, all of a sudden, it's like, aha, they couldn't have used Mark. Mark doesn't have any birth narrative. When they have to do something on their own, as it were, and it's not sayings material, they diverge totally. And if Matthew and Luke used Mark and Q, that's exactly what we'd expect. Where they couldn't rely on their common sources, they would diverge. So all these things are points. These are in fact the major arguments for the existence of Q and for the two-source hypothesis. Having, I hope, made the strongest case possible for it, I now want to complicate the story by noting some of the data that don't fit this model. The chief problem with the two-source hypothesis is what are called the minor agreements. And I'll illustrate what minor agreements are. Minor agreements are instances where Matthew and Luke agree with each other and not with Mark. That is, they agree against Mark, is how this is worded. These tend to be minor, not major. They tend to be little things. So this goes against the principle of Mark being the middle term. The principle of Mark being in the middle term is that it's Matthew and Mark together, or Mark and Luke together. These minor agreements are cases where it's Matthew and Luke. You'll notice here that both Luke and Matthew have a person having taken it in the parable of the sower. They both have a certain plant become a tree. They both mention branches. Those are little things, but if Matthew and Luke have not seen each other, that's quite a few little things. And the problem for the dominant hypothesis is that there are a lot of these little things. When Jesus is on trial and the soldiers are mocking him, Matthew and Luke have them say, "Who is the one who smote you?" In an early healing story, Matthew and Luke have the supplicant address Jesus as Lord. Matthew and Luke have a slightly different word order. They have touched him, whereas Mark has him touched. I'm being super literal in my translation here, so because Greek word order is more flexible than English word order, and Matthew and Luke have changed Mark's word order. And minor agreements can even go to the point of omissions. So Matthew and Luke both lack the expression moved with pity for Jesus. And that kind of makes you scratch your head, doesn't it? If they were using Mark, why would Matthew think, oh, I don't want to say that our Lord was moved with pity? And Mark and Luke also think, oh, I don't want to say that our Lord was moved with pity, and that's why he healed this person. That makes you scratch your head, doesn't it? And you sort of think, wait a minute. I wonder if there's some other explanation for why Matthew and Luke have these similarities. The minor agreements, to restate, are Matthew and Luke agreeing against Mark. And the problem is, Matthew and Luke are not supposed to have seen each other. And if they have seen each other, that's the easiest way to account for this, is that Matthew used Luke or Luke used Matthew. If they have seen each other, then there is no reason to postulate Q. Q is common sayings material. Well, if Matthew or Luke has used the other, there's no need for Q. And so the title of a famous article is called On Dispensing with Q, because Luke could have gotten all those sayings from the Gospel of Matthew. Diagrams then could look like the Augustinian model, that is, Bishop of Hippo Augustine addressed this problem and said, aha, Mark used Matthew, and Luke used both. No need for Q. A popular modern version of this is what's called the Griesbach hypothesis, or the two-gospel hypothesis. Griesbach, for what it's worth, was one of the first scholars to print synopses of the Gospels, that is, the parallel episodes in parallel columns. Griesbach's proposal was that Luke used Matthew, and then Mark used them both and conflated them. And so where Mark didn't find something in common to both of them, he didn't use it. So let's say Mark gets to the birth narratives and he thinks, gosh, they're different, so I won't use that part. I'm going to criticize the Griesbach hypothesis now. So first we criticize the dominant hypothesis, now we're criticizing the counter proposals. But before I criticize the Griesbach hypothesis, I want to observe that this diagram will account for all the data. Why do Luke and Matthew have sayings in common that aren't in Mark? Luke got them from Matthew, and Mark eliminated the ones he didn't find from both. It works. It works for Mark being the middle term. Why does Mark always agree with only Luke or only Matthew, or tend to? Well, because that's how Mark wrote his gospel. So this will account for the data. There are problems. What are the problems? In short, it's really hard to imagine Mark being the third of these three gospels. To note just the most kind of glaringly obvious examples, Mark is written in less good Greek. Now, it's one thing to not be able to compose elegant prose, but if you are already copying, why would you take a cleanly written sentence and muck it up and use cruder grammar or a poorer choice of words? Hard to explain. Mark is full of all sorts of difficult, just confusing expressions. Why would he have added? Much easier to imagine that Matthew and Luke got rid of those than that Mark added them. So time and again, Mark says, I don't know, something that's baffling, and it's hard to see why he would have added those. Mark has a lower Christology. That's a modern category, but not an altogether modern category, and that is that Mark treats Jesus more like a wonder-working figure along the lines of Apollonius of Tyana. Matthew and Luke go out of their way to have him be virgin-born, and something more like pre-existent, an incarnation of wisdom. Why would Mark lower the Christology in the second place when it looks like the trajectory is for Christians to have a higher and higher Christology? And finally, we have to imagine that Mark has omitted the resurrection accounts, the virgin birth, the Sermon on the Mount, a lot of good parables, and he's added, the strange stories like a naked young man, or stories like Jesus being unable to heal on his first try, and so making some mud with spittle and trying again. Anyway, you get the point. It's really hard to imagine this being the right diagram. A legitimate contender that is supported by a minority of current scholars that deviates from the two-source hypothesis is what's generally called the Farrer-Golder hypothesis. Sometimes it's also taken up quite seriously by E.P. Sanders, and that is that Mark's written first. That makes sense. Matthew uses Mark, and Luke uses the two of them. This avoids the problems of Mark being the latest gospel. It accounts for all the data. It itself has problems, and proponents of the two-source hypothesis will usually just say, hey, wait a minute. Can we really imagine that the Gospel of Luke used Matthew and left out really good stuff? And he took the Sermon on the Mount and he chopped it up and he spread it out. And he took the eschatological discourse and he chopped it up and he spread it out. Why would you do that? I mean, Matthew is so friggin' good. Why would you do what Luke does with it? There's no way to answer a question like that, of course. And people who subscribe to this understanding have written book-length responses to precisely that question. And they say, wait, Luke might have his reasons. And to the charge that Luke follows Mark, but changes Matthew, it's not quite true. Luke actually changes Mark quite a bit too. Luke seems to be the freest of the three in terms of changing the others. So let's take stock. Where are we at, and what seems like the best way to... I've been criticizing each of these different proposals. What do I think is the right proposal? I think probably something simple like the following. And you'll need to memorize this for the final exam and be able to reproduce it and write a paragraph explaining the justification with textual evidence for each of these separate stages in the creation and transmission of material about Jesus, as well as explaining why they likely originated in these different sites. That's a joke. You don't have to do this. I take this photocopy from a recent book on the synoptic problem because this is one scholar's proposal. And you can see that it's a lot more complicated than a four-source hypothesis, although lurking in there, there's Q, there's Mark, there's Luke, there's Matthew, but there's also Proto-Luke and L and different versions of the little apocalypse and so on and so forth. That's a really messy diagram. I also suspect it's closer to the truth. And to give one other sort of illustration of a recent diagram, and this is not that complicated. It's not as complicated as it first looks. This, I think, is about as good as we can actually do. You start with Jesus. He said stuff. He told parables. Those stories circulated. They were ultimately formulated, and not that much later, in a gospel, a message about Jesus, which would include he died for our sins. That all takes place prior to even Paul's letters, so it takes place quite early. That is orally transmitted even as things are written down. And what I like about this diagram is that you see that it incorporates something kind of like the two-source hypothesis. You got Mark, and you got Q, and you got Luke, and you got Matthew. But that isn't the whole story. You have oral transmission the whole time, even after the Gospels are written, even after Q is written. And that's why, look at this diagram carefully, this is why you find some of the same sayings in the Gospel of Thomas that you find in the Synoptic Gospels. It's why you find some of the same sayings in the Gospel of John. It's why you find second century authors quoting oral versions of things we also find in the Synoptics. So it's important to remember, when Mark wrote a story down, that wasn't the last time anybody ever told it orally. The oral tradition continues. If we wanted to conclude by saying, so why did we even bother with this hypothesis, especially if our lecturer, Jeremy, is skeptical about the ability to solve the synoptic problem, I'd say the synoptic problem is a good working hypothesis. It has a good amount of evidence to support it. It is not completely bulletproof. There are things that it does not explain well. But it is reasonable to think there were written oral traditions in Greek. Written traditions of Jesus' sayings, and they circulated in Greek. That's almost certainly the case. It's reasonable to think that Matthew and Luke used Mark. I think that's a pretty strong case. They might have used a different version of Mark. This means that as a working hypothesis, when we look at Matthew and when we look at Luke, we will say, at least to try it out, to provoke and prompt our own readings, we'll say, interesting, so Matthew, why did you do that with Mark? We don't have to be wedded to this hypothesis, but I think it is a helpful place to start. And hopefully I've illustrated some of the data, some of the arguments that make it plausible, while also going a little bit beyond what the textbooks usually do by showing that there are things the two-source hypothesis doesn't do a great job of accounting for. Thank you.